This week on the Communicators, a discussion about the government's preparations for the conversion to digital television with Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders.
This week on the Communicators, our guest is Senator Bernie Sanders, an independent of Vermont. Senator Sanders, we're about a month out from the analog to digital transition nationwide. What has been your approach to the DTV transition, and also are you hearing from constituents about this?
We are hearing from constituents. There's a lot of concern. We held a town meeting on just this issue in Burlington, Vermont in late October. This is the concern. The concern above and beyond the fact that the federal government has run out of money to provide the $40 for the converter boxes is that I worry very much that on February 18th, the day after the transition, millions of Americans, including a lot of lower income people, a lot of senior citizens, are going to turn on their television. You know what they're going to see? Nothing. They're going to see nothing, or they're going to see fewer channels than they previously had. These are folks who today don't have a lot of money, don't want a lot of TV, perhaps, but are getting off-air TV stations right now. And because of this transition and because of the geographical terrain in which they live, my state is a very hilly state. They may lose all reception or some of the channels. It is clear to me that the Bush administration and the Congress are not prepared for this transition, and we've got to be aggressive right now in addressing the problems.
Did Congress not appropriate enough money to begin with, $1.4 billion for this transition?
There is not enough money, whether it's Congress or the Bush administration's fault, I'm not sure. My understanding is that the Bush administration, until very recently, did not indicate that they needed the hundreds of millions of dollars more than they do need. But above and beyond that issue, which is important, is I think there has not been the kind of preparation for the many millions of people who may, in fact, lose all reception or some of the networks that they're currently getting.
Sanjay Talwani of TV Technology is also here to question Senator Sanders.
Yeah, there's a few issues here. I think the reception and antenna issue, as you mentioned, is a major problem. Of course, there's a problem now we're finding at the 11th hour, despite repeated warnings, that there is zero money left for converter boxes, and they're hoping to recycle the money back in from expired coupons. They're accumulating people on wait lists at the rate of hundreds of thousands a day, starting last week, and as you mentioned, there's these reception problems, and you know, we're kind of wondering in the TV and broadcasting business, you know, what's going to be done for all these people who don't just need a converter box and may have followed all the rules, gotten all the education, they do everything right, plug in the box, and they still have less than they had before. And to us, that's a problem that has only really been acknowledged by the FCC and others a little late in the game. And I guess we're leaving it to maybe you in Congress to...
well, we introduced, and I think you're exactly right, Sanjay. It is amazing to me, it really is, that I think members of Congress are going to be in for a very big surprise on February 18th. They're going to get a lot of telephone calls from constituents saying, excuse me, I just no longer have any TV reception at all. Now, what we did is introduced last session, I think, the most comprehensive approach to this problem, which did a couple of things, addressing the problems that Sanjay correctly pointed out. Number one, what we said is, for perhaps, and nobody knows exactly how many people, but perhaps millions of people, they're going to do all of the right things with a converter box, etc. They're still going to get poor or no reception. They're going to need an antenna to go up on their roof or a better indoor antenna. It seems to me, and the basic principle that I'm operating under, the federal government made this decision. And we should not be putting the cost onto individuals who really were quite content with the off-air TV that they currently have. They should not have to pick up a lot of expense. So what we said is, if you are not getting the kind of reception that you previously got, federal government should put in more money, up to $80 more, so that if you have to install an antenna on your roof, we will pay for that if you need some help doing that. I worry mostly about older people, lower income people, and in the wintertime, by the way, in Vermont in February is not a great time to be installing antennas on your roofs. That's number one. Now, what happens if even after you do all of that, if you're able to do it, you still don't get the reception that you need? What we have said in our legislation is two things. Number one, if you can get cable, And in my state and many rural states, a lot of people can't get cable. But if you can get cable, what our legislation says is that the cable companies should provide what we call a lifeline service, a minimum service, which will at least provide what people are now getting off of the air. And we said that the charge should not be higher than $10 a month. Now, the good news on that is that Comcast, at least, has come up with an approach like that. What I worry about, knowing Comcast, is that they'll use it as a promotional effort to bring people in, and the second year they'll double the rates to $20 or $30 or $50 a month. We don't want that. We think that the rates, people have a right to get TV reception, because TV today is not just a luxury. TV is how you learn about the world, it's how you learn about the weather, it's how you learn about tragedies that are taking place, and especially for many elderly people, it's their contact with the world. And then we also said that satellite companies should also be providing a lifeline minimum cost service. Now, the good news there is that Dish has also come up with a $9.99 approach, although there's an installation cost, but we worry about what they will do the second year as well. So those are the two things we're saying. Let's give people more money if they need outdoor antennas. Let's also demand that cable companies and satellite companies provide lifeline service so that people can at least get what they are currently receiving.
Well, speaking about your Lifeline service, Senator Sanders, you used the word indefinitely in that legislation, correct?
Yes.
Has it any chance of passing, and would it be able to take effect before February 17th?
I'll tell you, one of the things that has amazed me, and Sanjay, you may want to comment on this, is how relatively little attention has been paid to this issue until very recently. But I think the Obama people are aware of the problem, and more members of Congress are now catching on. So I can't predict the fate of our legislation. I know that in the House, similar legislation to mine is being introduced. There is certainly increased discussion. There is even, frankly, some discussion about delaying the implementation of this plan, because the perception is that the Bush administration, through their overall incompetence, has left us in a position where we're just not ready for this transition.
Do you foresee the Congress delaying the February 17th date?
I think it's an issue that's being discussed. I can't give you a prediction on it, but I think that, I mean, just from a political point of view, you don't want to be the congressman or the senator to have to take the phone calls from people who've lost their reception and say, you know, television is important to my life. I'm an elderly person. That's what I do. Why did you impose regulations that make me lose my TV? I mean, we're supposed to be moving forward, not backwards. You know, we've had TV for about 50 years. To take it away from millions of people is not a very sensible proposal.
You know, which raises the question of what are we going to do on February 18th to handle what could be an outcry. People are going to be calling the FCC, people are going to be calling your office, they're going to call whoever they feel is to blame. And part of the answer may come from the local stations, the state association, the state broadcasting associations, because they've really focused their outreach to be more locally relevant, and they've developed call centers that respond more appropriately to people's concerns, because if you call from a certain geographic area, they can say, oh yes, a lot of people are having reception problems there, you may need a new antenna, you may need to get satellite. So, you know, a question for Congress and for the FCC is exactly, you know, what do you do on that day, February 18th, when you get, by some estimate, as many as 2 million phone calls, not just 2 million people who are losing the service and are disappointed in seeing snow on their TV. And there's talk of call centers, but we don't know if those call centers, people will be even more frustrated if they call and get kind of a hold or a...
Senator Sanders.
Well, I think the local stations have been trying very hard and effectively to educate people about what's going on. But you can educate people, but the point you made a few moments ago is if somebody does all of the right things, they're well educated, they respond to their information they've gotten, they still may end up with fewer stations or with no stations at all. My hope is that by February 18th, Congress will have already done the right thing. Now, whether that can happen in such a short period of time, in such a momentous moment when we're dealing with so many other issues, remains to be seen. So it's either pushing back the transition date and making sure that when somebody calls, the person at the other end of the line can say, okay, two things. I want you to call this number, because your cable TV company will provide you with an inexpensive Lifeline service, as will your satellite company. And in addition to that, if you don't want to do that, we're going to make more money available to you so you can have a better quality antenna that should help.
Well, Ann Curran of Vermont Public Television is joining us from Vermont. Ann Curran, are you prepared for X number of phone calls on February 18th?
Well, actually, we just met the local stations group in Vermont and in the Plattsburgh area of New York that's part of the market, had a meeting to talk about that. Our hope is that we can staff a local call center, because our experience with doing tests and doing local call-ins is that people really want local information. And so Vermont Public Television has agreed to be the host for a call center if we have the staffing support that we know we'll get from the other stations, and the financial support to share expenses.
And where do you get that financial support?
We'll all have to chip in, and unless there's something in the way of some federal money subsidizing this, we will all chip in and make our own staff available. That's the plan right now, to have our own call takers and our own technicians at the BPT studio to answer questions, and to share the phone expenses, which could be significant. But we have 6 stations involved, and we've been sharing expenses 6 ways in all the various activities that we've been doing.
And Curran, Vermont conducted a soft test of the digital transition, correct?
We did on December 16th. This was really an unprecedented effort to have all of the affiliates, the CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, and 2 PBS stations, our station and the station based in Plattsburgh, New York, Mountain Lake PBS, were staffing the phones. We had about 44 call takers between the 2 sites here at the 2 PBS stations, because, as most people know, PBS stations are usually pretty well armed with telephones, and so we were the natural place to host it. And we had about a dozen technicians who spent a lot of time on the phone with individuals, trying to address and help them with their very specific technical questions.
And Ann Curran, what would your message be to Senator Sanders?
Well, greetings, Senator Sanders.
Ann, how are you?
I'm very well, and we are working kind of one viewer at a time right now. Vermont Public Television had our 3rd play of a 1-hour call-in program this week, and once again we were flooded with calls for an hour. But I'm excited about the idea that people may be able to get some financial help with coupons, making more coupons available if that's possible, making antenna coupons available. Would be very excited about that, and of course any kind of affordable cable or satellite service would be just great, because we take so many of the phone calls that we hear from people who, for them, it maybe buying a converter box or 2 with a coupon is manageable, but when we start having to tell them that in many cases they're going to have to consider a better indoor antenna or maybe an outdoor antenna and someone to install it, that begins to talk about possibly hundreds of dollars. And that's a real challenge for people, especially in today's economy.
Well, Ann makes, first of all, I want to congratulate Ann and Vermont Public Television. They helped us in the town meeting that we put on in October, and they have been doing a very conscientious job. But the point that Ann makes is that by and large, in 2009, if you don't have satellite today, if you don't have cable and it is accessible to you, there's a reason for it, and perhaps you can't afford it. So the point that Ann is making is that a lot of the people who are going to be in trouble now don't have a lot of money. And if you say to them, well, gee, you're going to have to get satellite, that's not really a good answer if you're a senior citizen living on Social Security or you're a lower income person. So I think it is obligatory for the federal government. This act did not come from God. It came from the federal government, who said that on a certain date there's a transition, and tough luck to you. Well, that's wrong. So we have got to support those people who need the financial help to make this transition.
Sanjay Talwani.
A question for Ann. Maybe you can give some advice to a projection of what you're going to do as the big day draws closer, and advice maybe for other broadcasters, especially larger markets, helping people one by one, and even having staff going out to help some people is great. But in larger markets, helping hundreds of thousands of individuals one by one and sending technicians to their house isn't practical. And then on a more more local level, you may have a well-staffed call center now, but you of course you'll have a much higher volume of calls when the signal actually disappears and you're running there's a snow on the analog signal or a slate that says call a certain number. So do you have any plans or any means to really uptick this outreach, uptick these call centers, and also what do you see that the bigger market stations, which will get obviously many more calls, what can they do? And so how do you look at this upcoming date?
And Curran.
Well, there are models all over the country as for what some of the larger stations and statewide services are doing. Some have already contracted with professional call center services, where they can, agree that they will have up to a certain number of people being able to answer calls at the same time. We have a little bit of information from the markets that shut down their analog early, which to me was somewhat reassuring in that people are not all calling at once. They tend to have peaks and valleys and call around some of the most popular shows. So I think the best any of us can do is to try to gauge by the percentages we think may be unready in our markets, and then look at where the points in our schedules will be that you'll have the highest number of calls and people wondering what happened or how to get a station, and staff for that. But there's no doubt that any of us, as best we plan, could be overwhelmed and have to take messages and have people leave a phone number and know that they will be getting back, because these technical conversations, we've learned, can go on for 10 minutes or so before the viewer really understands what he or she should be trying to do, and sometimes they want you to stay right on the phone with them while they try rescanning or doing something, and we're happy to do that and try to get them through this. And of course, people are very grateful when they get that kind of local help. But,
I think we're dealing with two separate issues here. Number one is the calling stations, so that when people call up, somebody is at the other end of the line who can explain to them what is going on, what they might have to do. But the second issue, which is a lot more difficult, you talk about sending out people to help. Well, you know what? In a rural area where people may be separated by 20 or 30 miles and you got to go to house by house, and in an urban area where maybe a whole lot of people, that is an expensive proposition. And that's what we haven't figured out. So number one, we got to explain to people. You can explain to people, and they're going to need help. And that second part is what worries me most.
That's true, and none of us local stations in Vermont and the northeast part of New York are staffed to be able to send technicians out into the homes. We have also been in touch with certain organizations that do some outreach and have even done a little bit of training with one of them to try to let people who do direct service with elders and so forth learn how to install a converter box. But that only gets you so far, and it is a real challenge. That we do maintain a list of antenna technicians by locality that we can refer people to, but of course those folks may be very, very busy.
Ironically, if I might, this is in terms of the stimulus package. You want to talk about job creation? You can create some jobs hiring people to do just that, and that's an issue we'll be pushing as well.
This is a question for both Senator Sanders and for Ann Curran. Has the FCC been helpful in this transition? And Ann Curran, when you call the FCC with questions or the NTIA with questions, have you gotten good responses? Question for both of you.
Well, I guess from a station perspective, it's somewhat mixed. There is wonderful information available from both of those programs, but there are some, like if you want to know how to hook up a converter box with a VCR, you'll find wonderful information on the FCC's site. And I know that they are staffing their own call center and information. There certainly have been problems with on both sides, some of it being, I think, a little bit late to the game as far as realizing that they needed to actually, in some cases, require stations. That hasn't been the case in our market. We were out there in front pretty early. But in some markets, they've actually mandated that stations have to put on a certain number of spots and certain half-hour informational programs and do some of that. And then on the coupon side, there have been obviously some real problems. Here in a rural state, we've had so many people who have post office boxes who early in the stages of the coupon program were denied, And then I often have talked to people who've been denied for sometimes unexplained reasons, who just got shut out and don't have coupons and really need them. So we've been kind of collecting them from some of our friends and relatives and trying to make them available to people as best we could.
Well, I I agree with Ann. I think, but overall, I think the proof is in the pudding. If what I think many people are concluding, we're not ready for this transition, who is responsible for not being ready? And that has to be the Bush administration and the FCC. I know Michael Copps, one of the commissioners, was in Vermont talking about this issue, and I think some of the people there are trying to do the right thing. But overall, if you run out of coupons, if millions of people may lose reception, somebody has to be held accountable, and I think it would not shock many viewers to know that we don't have a particularly competent administration under President Bush, and shouldn't be surprised that they've failed once again.
Well, I think there were a lot of preparation issues, and a lot of the consumer groups are now kind of saying, I told you so, on some of these matters. There were warnings that the coupon program would run out of money, and Congress repeatedly asked NTIA, which is administering the coupon program, if they had enough money, and it was only in the last couple of months where they said, yes, we do need more money. Right after the new year, they ran out. There were technical things that broadcasters may have been able to do, some new types of transmission systems. Broadcasters are pushing for this, some people within the government were pushing for this, but it was only very late in the game, late last year, that the FCC started making rules for some of these systems, for what a system called distributed transmission system, and the translator system, which essentially, to oversimplify, basically means putting up more towers and sending out more signals to cover dark areas. The chairman of the FCC, Kevin Martin, for a long time was a little bit dismissive of the notion that people who did all the right things would not, simply because of the way the signals go, would simply not get a digital TV signal where for 40, 50 years previously they'd gotten an analog signal. So obviously I agree with Senator Sanders that there has been a lot of frustration, and I guess the question is now, in best case scenario, the coupons come 4 to 6 weeks after they're ordered. We're outside that window. Even if you passed legislation tomorrow for some kind of an antenna subsidy program, we're kind of looking at a little far out there, and we're going to have a big gap where people lose TV. And as you said, these are some of the most vulnerable people. They're people who don't use the internet. They're people who are elderly. They're people who don't speak English. They're people who are poor. They're people who live in rural areas that don't have the cable option, and you know, may not want the hassle of a dish. And maybe my question to the Senator would be, given the current climate, given all the priorities and the demands for money, and given that there's some people who feel that too much money has already been thrown at this program, what are the chances to kind of uptick this with more with this antenna program, which sounds great to a lot of people, particularly antenna makers?
Well, to answer your question, yeah, we have an economy that's collapsing, a healthcare system that's falling apart, we have a war in the Middle East, so there are one or two other problems out there. On the other hand, politicians being what we are, we do know that if somebody turns on the TV and there's nothing there, you know what? You can worry about Gaza, but you got to worry about that as well. So I think that, although I have been amazed at how slow members of Congress have responded to this issue, I think you're going to see an accelerated concern, because this is really a political issue. And I think if I were Barack Obama coming into office, the last thing I want a month into my presidency is millions of people saying, hey, you're the president, I don't have any TV anymore, what did you do? And Obama's people are very smart. I think they understand this issue. So one of the options that I think people are looking at is saying, hey, we haven't gotten our act together, we're going to have to push this back a little bit longer so that we can address some of your concerns.
Well, Senator, that's a nice transition into the incoming Obama administration. You've been a pretty vocal advocate of net neutrality and some other issues. What do you expect from an Obama administration?
Well, I think the issue of media in general and the internet are huge issues for this country. I mean, there's a revolution in communications, and certainly the internet is in the middle of that. And we do not want to see a continuation of the process that we're seeing right now, where a small number of large multinational corporations controlling the flow of information on television and newspapers. So I think you will see within the Obama administration a very strong effort to make sure that small entities have the same possibilities that CNN and the New York Times and other large entities have. That's very, very important to me, and I suspect many people in the Obama administration
Do you see
share that.
net neutrality becoming an issue again in the next Congress, in the 111th?
I think so. I think the revolution is on the internet. I don't have to explain to anybody that fewer people read newspapers, fewer people are watching network television. So it's an issue that has to be addressed. The goal, of course, is to make sure that people have as wide a range of options on the internet as possible, and those people who develop websites have the opportunity to communicate with people around the world as much as possible, and not see that entity controlled by big money interests.
Ann Curran of Vermont Public Television, thank you for joining us on this Communicators. Sanjay Talwani, what is a soft test?
A soft test, they've been calling it a analog shutoff test. It's really a simulated shutoff in which the people who are viewing over the air through an antenna would, instead of their normal program, would get something else, a 30-second, a 2-minute slate or message, a screen thing that says, if you see this picture, you do not have digital TV, and you need to either get a digital TV set, which you can buy at the store, or get a converter box, which you can buy at the store, although actually there's a rush on converter boxes as well, or get cable or satellite. And so it's in some ways these outreach efforts and these educational efforts have been enormously successful in that they have driven demand for the coupons. That's one reason they're running out of coupon money, is because broadcasters and grassroots groups, the consumer groups, and government agencies have had a very heroic effort to get the message out. Now they've gotten the message out. There's some issues with the laws of physics and getting the signal, and there's some issues with the money for the boxes and supply of boxes. So the soft test, and there have been an awful lot of these, and there'll be a few more. Sometimes they're doing it in the whole market-wide, so no matter what channel you're watching, every single one of them, you can't switch to another channel, you're going to get this thing. So you really have to be going out of your way. If you're a TV watcher, you have to go out of your way to have missed the message. So the soft test, and of course they develop a spike in the calls to the station. They put a number, they get calls. And it's been very useful for the stations to learn where their problems are, what kind of problems they're having, and actually 90% of the largest number of calls they've been getting based on these soft tests have been people who simply want the basic fact of how do I get a converter box coupon. And so
Senator Sanders,
information which is not going to be particularly useful right now, right?
Senator, are you satisfied with the efforts that Sanjay Talwani was describing, broadcasters and cable companies' outreach?
I mean, yes and no. I think they have made, I know in Vermont our people have worked very hard to educate folks, but I think they also have an obligation to raise the red flag that despite all of the education, we have some very, very serious problems in a very short time frame to address those problems.
Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, Sanjay Talwani of TV Technology, tvtechnology.com is the website. Thank you both for being on the Communicators this week.
Thank you very much.
This is an issue that the Communicators will be looking at over the next month as we get closer to February 17th.